She had 6 hours until her execution. 6 hours until the state would inject poison into her veins for a murder she didn't commit. Her last request shocked everyone. "I want to be alone in a room. No guards, no cameras, just me and God for 6 hours." They granted it, thinking it was just a dying woman's final prayer. But what happened during those 6 hours can't be explained by science or logic. A fire. A confession. A reversal. Some call it coincidence. Others call it divine intervention. But everyone agrees Sarah Williams should have died that night. And she didn't. Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you believe about faith, justice, and the impossible. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story will leave you questioning everything. Sarah Williams was 32 years old when she was convicted of murdering her business partner, Jennifer Cole. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence that seemed overwhelming at the time. Sarah and Jennifer had argued publicly about money 2 weeks before Jennifer's death. Sarah's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, a letter opener from their shared office. Security footage showed Sarah leaving the office building at 11:45 p.m., around the estimated time of death. And perhaps most damning, Sarah had taken out a large life insurance policy on Jennifer just 3 months before the murder, with herself as the beneficiary. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The judge, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the violation of trust between business partners, sentenced Sarah to death. That was 15 years ago. During those 15 years, Sarah had exhausted every appeal. Her court-appointed attorney had done his best, but he was overworked and under-resourced. Private investigators cost money Sarah didn't have. Her family had mortgaged their home to pay for the initial defense and couldn't afford more. One by one, her appeals were denied. The evidence, the court said, was clear. The jury had decided. Justice had been served. But Sarah knew the truth. She hadn't killed Jennifer. She'd loved Jennifer like a sister. They'd started their marketing firm together right out of college, building it from nothing into a successful business over 8 years. Yes, they'd argued about money. Every business partnership had financial disagreements. But murder, Sarah would never. The fingerprints on the letter opener, of course they were there. It was their shared office space. She'd used that letter opener dozens of times. The security footage, she had been working late, as she often did. She'd left the building and driven home, not knowing that Jennifer was already dead in the office she'd left behind. And the insurance policy, that had been Jennifer's idea. They'd both taken out policies on each other, a standard practice for business partners to protect the company if something happened to one of them. But the prosecution made it sound sinister, made it sound like Sarah had been planning Jennifer's murder for months. After 15 years of appeals and denials, Sarah had run out of options. Her execution date was set for March 15th at midnight. As the date approached, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She'd spent 15 years fighting, 15 years insisting on her innocence, 15 years hoping that somehow the truth would come to light. But hope was exhausting. And now, facing the reality of her impending death, Sarah found herself letting go of hope and embracing something different: faith. Sarah had never been particularly religious before her incarceration. She'd grown up going to church occasionally with her family, but it had never been a central part of her life. But in prison, facing the darkest moments of her existence, she'd started reading the Bible that the chaplain had given her. At first, it was just something to pass the time. But gradually, the words began to speak to her in ways she hadn't expected. Stories of people facing impossible odds, promises of justice and redemption, the idea that suffering could have meaning, that even in the darkest valley, she was not alone. Sarah started attending the prison chapel services. She joined a Bible study group. She prayed, not with the desperate begging of someone trying to bargain with God, but with the quiet conversation of someone seeking companionship in her loneliness. And over time, Sarah's faith grew into something solid and unshakable. She didn't know why Jennifer had been killed, or why she'd been blamed for it. She didn't know if she'd ever see justice in this life, but she believed, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that truth existed somewhere beyond the broken systems of human justice, that her innocence was known, even if it was never proven, that her life had mattered, even if it was about to end unjustly. 3 days before her execution, Sarah was moved to a special cell in the death house. the section of the prison reserved for inmates in their final days. The guards were professional but somber. Everyone knew executions were difficult, even for the staff who'd witnessed them before. There was something heavy about participating in a state-sanctioned death, even when you believed the person deserved it. And many of the guards weren't sure Sarah did deserve it. She'd been a model prisoner for 15 years, kind to staff, helpful to other inmates, never causing trouble. She'd maintained her innocence with a quiet dignity that was hard to dismiss. But it wasn't their job to determine guilt or innocence. The courts had decided. Their job was to carry out the sentence. On her last full day of life, Sarah was allowed final visitors. Her mother came, a woman now in her 70s who'd aged decades in the 15 years since her daughter's conviction. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by glass, speaking through phones. "I'm so sorry, baby," her mother said, tears streaming down her face. "I failed you. I should have found more money for better lawyers. I should have done more." "Mom," Sarah said gently, "you did everything you could. This isn't your fault, and I'm okay. I really am." "How can you be okay? You're innocent, and they're going to kill you tomorrow." Sarah smiled, and there was genuine peace in her expression. "Because I know the truth, and I know God knows the truth. That has to be enough." After her mother left, Sarah had one more visitor, Father Michael Chen, the prison chaplain, who'd been her spiritual guide for the past 10 years. He was a man in his 60s, gentle and wise, who'd counseled hundreds of inmates through their darkest moments. "Sarah," he said, sitting across from her in the small consultation room, "how are you feeling?" "Peaceful," Sarah replied, which probably sounds crazy, but it's true. Father Chen nodded. "That's grace. That's what it looks like when faith becomes more real than circumstances." They talked for an hour about scripture, about heaven, about what came after death. Then Father Chen asked the question. He asked all condemned inmates, "Do you have any final requests for your last hours?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and certain. "I want to spend my last 6 hours alone in a room. No guards watching through the window. No cameras. Just me and God. I want to pray." Father Chen looked surprised. 6 hours is a long time. Most inmates want company in their final hours. Family. Spiritual advisors. Someone to sit with them. "You're sure you want to be alone?" Sarah nodded. "I've spent 15 years surrounded by people. Guards. Inmates. Lawyers. Visitors. I've never had true solitude. Just once. Before I die. I want to experience it. I want to be alone with God, and see what happens." Father Chen promised to relay her request to the warden. Later that evening, Warden Michael Torres sat in his office considering Sarah's unusual request. Torres was 58 years old, and had been warden at this facility for 12 years. He'd overseen 47 executions in his career. Some inmates spent their last hours with family, some with lawyers making desperate last-minute appeals, some with spiritual advisors seeking peace, but he'd never had anyone request to be completely alone. His first instinct was to deny it. There were protocols, security concerns. Inmates on death row needed constant supervision, especially in their final hours. The risk of suicide or self-harm was high, but Torres found himself hesitating. Something about Sarah Williams had always bothered him. He'd read her case file multiple times over the years. The evidence seemed solid on paper, but there was something that didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was her consistent maintenance of innocence. Maybe it was the lack of any violent behavior in 15 years of incarceration. Maybe it was just a gut feeling that the justice system had gotten this one wrong. Finally, Torres made a decision. He called his head of security and Father Chen into his office. "Sarah Williams has requested to spend her last 6 hours alone in a room. Completely alone. No monitoring." The security chief immediately objected. "Sir, that violates every protocol we have. We can't leave a death row inmate unsupervised. What if she tries to harm herself? What if something goes wrong?" Torres held up his hand. "She's going to die at midnight regardless. If she wants to spend her last hours in peace, praying, who are we to deny her that dignity? We'll put her in the meditation room in the chapel. It's secure, only one door, no windows. We'll lock it from the outside. She can't escape and she can't hurt anyone but herself. And if she chooses to end things on her own terms rather than wait for the injection, is that really so terrible?" Father Chen spoke up. I support this. Sarah has earned the right to face her death in the way that brings her peace. If that means solitude and prayer, we should grant it. After more discussion, they agreed on a compromise. Sarah would be placed in the small meditation room adjacent to the prison chapel at 6 p.m. The door would be locked from the outside. No cameras, no audio monitoring, no guards watching through the window. At 11:30 p.m., they would retrieve her and escort her to the execution chamber. 6 hours of complete solitude. 6 hours to make her peace with God and her fate. At 5:45 p.m. on March 15th, 2 guards escorted Sarah from her cell to the chapel. She'd been given a simple gray jumpsuit to wear, more dignified than the orange prison uniform. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, a requirement for any inmate movement, even one with only hours left to live. Father Chen met them at the chapel entrance. "Are you ready?" he asked Sarah. She nodded. "I am." They walked through the main chapel, past the rows of simple wooden pews, to a small door at the back. Behind it was a room maybe 10 feet square. White walls, gray carpeted floor, no furniture except a single chair, no decorations except a simple wooden cross on one wall. It was a space designed for quiet contemplation, used by both staff and inmates who needed a place to pray or meditate. "Sarah," Father Chen said gently, "I want you to know that I'll be in the chapel if you need anything. Just knock on the door and I'll hear you." Sarah smiled at him. "Thank you, Father, for everything. For the past 10 years, you helped me find something worth having, even in here." They removed her handcuffs. She stepped into the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The lock engaged, and Sarah Williams was alone. Completely alone for the first time in 15 years. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, adjusting to the silence. In prison there was always noise, voices, metal doors clanging, guards calling out, other inmates crying or laughing or fighting. Even in solitary confinement, you could hear the sounds of the prison around you. But this room was different. It was properly soundproofed, designed to provide true quiet for meditation. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, her own breathing, nothing else. She looked at her watch. 6 p.m. exactly. 6 hours until midnight. 6 hours until she would be strapped to a gurney and given a lethal injection. 6 hours to live. Sarah walked to the chair and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap, closed her eyes, and began to pray. Not with memorized prayers or formal liturgy, but with the simple words of someone talking to a friend. "God," she said quietly, "I don't know if you're going to stop this. I don't know if there's going to be some last-minute miracle. I'm not asking for one. I made my peace with dying. But if there's any way the truth could come out, if Jennifer's real killer could be found, if my name could be cleared, even after I'm gone, I'm asking for that. Not for me, for my mother. She deserves to know her daughter wasn't a murderer." And then Sarah stopped asking, and simply sat in the presence she felt around her. Meanwhile, outside the meditation room, life continued. Warden Torres sat in his office, working on paperwork but finding it hard to concentrate. Father Chen knelt in the chapel, praying for Sarah. The execution team began preparing the chamber, running through checklists and protocols. And in the world beyond the prison walls, events were beginning to unfold that no one could have predicted. 6:15 p.m. 200 miles away in the state capital, a fire broke out in the building that housed the district attorney's office. The building was mostly empty at that hour. Just a few lawyers working late. The fire started in a storage room on the 3rd floor, where old case files were kept. By the time the fire department arrived, flames were spreading rapidly. Firefighters evacuated the building and worked to contain the blaze. Among the rooms damaged was the archive where evidence from old cases was stored, including, though no one knew it yet, boxes related to the Jennifer Cole murder case. 6:47 p.m. In a hospital emergency room, 3 hours from the prison, a man named Robert Davidson collapsed in the parking lot. He'd been visiting his elderly mother on the cardiac floor when he suddenly felt chest pains. Security guards rushed to help him. Paramedics were called. He was brought into the ER, where doctors quickly determined he was having a serious heart attack. They rushed him to surgery. And there, as they worked to save his life, Robert Davidson began to talk. Anesthesia has strange effects on people. Some patients babble nonsense. Some reveal secrets they've kept hidden for years. Robert Davidson, drifting in and out of consciousness, Started talking about Jennifer Cole, about how he'd killed her 15 years ago, about how he'd let someone else take the blame. The surgical nurse thought he was confused, his mind playing tricks as the anesthesia took effect. But something made her write down what he was saying, write down the names, write down the details. After the surgery, when Robert Davidson was stable, the nurse reported what she'd heard to the hospital security. They called the police. 7:23 p.m. Detective Maria Santos had been with the state police for 22 years. She'd worked hundreds of cases, and she prided herself on her thoroughness and integrity. When she got the call about a man confessing to a murder under anesthesia, her first instinct was skepticism. Anesthesia confessions were notoriously unreliable. People said all kinds of things when they were drugged. But Santos was also meticulous. She took down the information, ran the names through the database, and felt her heart sink when she saw that Jennifer Cole had been murdered 15 years ago, and that a woman named Sarah Williams was currently on death row for that murder, scheduled for execution at midnight. In less than 5 hours, Santos grabbed her partner and rushed to the hospital. She needed to talk to Robert Davidson immediately, but when she arrived, the doctors told her Davidson was unconscious, recovering from surgery. He wouldn't be lucid enough to talk for several hours. Santos pulled the nurse aside and got the full story. What exactly did he say? The nurse consulted her notes. He said Jennifer wouldn't give him the money. He said she threatened to report him. He said he didn't mean to kill her, but she wouldn't stop yelling, and he grabbed the letter opener. Then he said something about someone else being arrested, and how he knew it was wrong, but he was scared. Santos felt sick. If this was true, an innocent woman was about to be executed in less than 5 hours. She immediately called her captain. They needed to stop the execution. They needed to investigate this confession. But the captain was cautious. A drugged confession from a man in surgery wasn't enough to halt an execution. They needed more. They needed evidence. They needed to verify Davidson's story. They needed time they didn't have. 8:15 p.m. At the prison, Warden Torres received a call from the state police. Detective Santos explained the situation quickly. We have a potential confession to the Jennifer Cole murder. Different suspect. We need time to investigate before you execute Sarah Williams. Torres felt his stomach dropped. How solid is this confession? Not solid enough, Santos admitted. It was made under anesthesia. The man is unconscious now. We need to interview him properly. Verify his story, check for evidence. But if he's telling the truth, you're about to execute an innocent woman. How much time do you need? I don't know. Days. Maybe. We need to reconstruct a 15-year-old case. Torres looked at the clock. It's 8:15. The execution is scheduled for midnight. I can delay for a few hours, but not days. Not without a court order. Then get me a court order, Santos said. Contact the judge who sentenced her. Contact the Attorney General. Someone with authority needs to halt this execution while we investigate. Torres immediately began making calls. He called the sentencing judge, who was at home having dinner. He called the Attorney General's office. He called the governor's office. But it was evening. People were hard to reach, and more importantly, everyone he talked to had the same question. How credible is this confession? One person rambling, under anesthesia, wasn't enough to overturn 15 years of appeals and a jury verdict. They needed more. 8:40 p.m. Back in the meditation room, Sarah continued to pray. She had no idea about the fire, the confession, the frantic phone calls happening around her. She was focused inward, on the peace she felt, on the presence she sensed in the silence. She prayed for her mother, for Jennifer's family, who deserved to know the truth about who had really killed their daughter, for the guards who would have to carry out the execution, for Father Chen, for everyone whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. And she prayed prayers of gratitude. Thank you for giving me faith in these dark years. Thank you for the friendships I've made here. Thank you for showing me that my value isn't determined by what people think of me. Thank you for the peace that passes understanding. 9:17 p.m. Detective Santos was not giving up. She'd sent officers to Robert Davidson's home to search for any evidence connecting him to Jennifer Cole. She'd requested Davidson's phone records from 15 years ago. She'd contacted the prosecutor, who had tried Sarah Williams' case, now retired, to see if Davidson's name had ever come up in the investigation. And then Santos did something that might save Sarah's life, or might mean nothing at all. She requested that firefighters at the DA's office specifically search the evidence room for anything related to the Jennifer Cole case. It was a long shot. The fire might have destroyed everything, but Santos had learned to pursue every lead, no matter how unlikely. 9:42 p.m. At the fire scene, firefighters had mostly contained the blaze. The damage was significant, but localized to the third and fourth floors. The evidence room was on the third floor, and it had sustained both fire and water damage. When Santos's request came through, the fire chief assigned 2 investigators to search through the damaged evidence room for anything related to Jennifer Cole. They worked carefully, aware that time was running out. The execution was scheduled for midnight. It was now 9:45. At 10:08 p.m., one of the investigators found something. A box labeled Cole, Jennifer, case number 2009-4782. It was damaged but not destroyed. Inside were evidence bags, case files, and something the investigator thought was important enough to call Detective Santos immediately. "There's a phone here," the investigator said. "An old flip phone in an evidence bag. It's listed as belonging to Jennifer Cole." Santos felt her pulse quicken. A phone? Was that analyzed during the original investigation? The investigator checked the case log attached to the box. According to this, it was logged as evidence, but notes say it was water damaged and inoperable. Couldn't retrieve any data from it. Santos thought quickly. Technology from 15 years ago was primitive compared to now. A phone that couldn't be accessed then might be accessible with modern forensic tools. "Get that phone to the state crime lab immediately," Santos ordered. "Tell them it's an emergency related to tonight's execution. Tell them I need any data they can pull from it in the next hour." The investigator looked at the clock. "Ma'am, it's after 10 p.m. The lab is closed." "Then wake somebody up," Santos said. "Call the lab director at home. Call whoever you have to call. Get that phone analyzed now." 10:28 p.m. The crime lab director, Dr. Patricia Wong, was watching television when she got the call. She listened to the situation, understood the urgency, and called 2 of her best technicians. They met her at the lab at 10:45 p.m. They had 1 hour and 15 minutes until Sarah Williams's scheduled execution. Dr. Wong took the water-damaged phone and began the delicate process of extracting any data that might still be recoverable. "This is 15 years old," she told Detective Santos over the phone. "Water damaged. The chances of recovering anything useful are minimal." "Do your best," Santos said. "An innocent woman's life might depend on it." At the prison, Warden Torres had succeeded in reaching a judge willing to consider an emergency stay of execution. But the judge needed evidence. A confession made under anesthesia wasn't enough. They needed something concrete, something that proved Robert Davidson's involvement and raised real doubt about Sarah Williams's guilt. Torres looked at the clock. 11 p.m., 1 hour until the scheduled execution. He walked to the chapel and stood outside the meditation room door. Inside, Sarah Williams was still praying, unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. Torres felt a strange sense of disconnect. Inside that room, a woman prepared to die with dignity and faith. Outside, the world was scrambling to determine if she should die at all. 11:12 p.m. In the meditation room, Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her watch. She'd been praying for over 5 hours. 50 minutes left until midnight. She felt calm, ready. Whatever happened next, she was at peace with it. 11:23 p.m. Dr. Wong's technician made a breakthrough. Using specialized equipment that hadn't existed 15 years ago, he'd managed to recover some data from Jennifer Cole's damaged phone, including text messages from the weeks before her death. Dr. Wong read through them quickly and felt her pulse spike. There were numerous messages to and from a number identified in Jennifer's contacts as Rob D. The messages were about money, about Jennifer refusing to falsify company financial records, about threats, about a meeting the night of her death. Dr. Wong called Detective Santos immediately. "I've got text messages between Jennifer Cole and someone named Rob D. They indicate a dispute over money and possible financial fraud. The last message is from the day she died, confirming a meeting that night at the office." Santos felt electricity run through her body. "Rob D. Robert Davidson. Can you send those messages to me immediately?" "Already done. Check your email." Santos opened the messages on her phone and read quickly. This was it. This was the evidence they needed. She immediately forwarded the messages to Warden Torres, to the judge considering the stay to the Attorney General. 11:38 p.m. 22 minutes until the scheduled execution. Warden Torres received the text messages and immediately walked them to the execution chamber where the execution team was preparing. He showed them to the prosecutor's representative, to the medical personnel, to everyone involved. "We have new evidence," Torres announced. "Evidence that suggests another person committed this murder. I'm calling the judge for an emergency stay. In the meantime, I'm suspending execution protocols." The prosecutor's representative objected. "Warden, you don't have the authority to halt a lawfully ordered execution." "I do have the authority to delay for technical or procedural reasons," Torres replied, "and I'm exercising that authority now. Consider this a technical delay while we await a judicial ruling." He pulled out his phone and called the judge, who was already reviewing the text messages Santos had sent. "Your Honor," Torres said, "we have credible evidence that Sarah Williams may be innocent. I'm requesting an emergency stay of execution." The judge was quiet for a moment. "Warden, based on what I'm seeing, I'm prepared to grant a temporary stay pending further investigation. I'll have the order drawn up immediately." Torres felt relief flood through him. "How long will that take?" 15 minutes, 20 at most. It was 11:42 p.m. 18 minutes until midnight. Torres made a decision. He walked to the chapel and stood outside the meditation room. Inside, Sarah Williams had 12 minutes left in her 6-hour prayer. Torres knocked softly on the door. "Sarah, it's Warden Torres. Can you hear me?" Inside the room, Sarah opened her eyes. She heard the knock, heard the warden's voice. For a moment she thought they were coming to take her early to the execution chamber. But there was something different in the warden's tone, something that didn't sound like the voice of a man preparing to oversee an execution. "Sarah," Torres said through the door, "I need you to listen to me carefully. We've received new evidence in your case. A confession from another person. Text messages between Jennifer Cole and this person. I've requested an emergency stay of execution, and a judge is preparing the order now. We're not proceeding with your execution tonight." Sarah sat in the chair, frozen. She couldn't process what she was hearing. A confession? Evidence? Not proceeding with the execution. It must be a mistake. Some cruel misunderstanding. "Sarah, do you understand what I'm saying? Your execution has been stayed. You're not going to die tonight." Sarah stood on shaking legs and walked to the door. She placed her palm against it, as if she could reach through the wood to confirm this was real. "I don't understand," she said. "What happened?" "A lot happened," Torres replied. "More than I can explain right now. But during the 6 hours you've been in there praying, the entire universe seemed to shift. A man confessed to Jennifer's murder. He's in a hospital right now recovering from heart surgery. And as soon as he's conscious, police will interview him. We found text messages on Jennifer's phone that support his story. Messages that were missed in the original investigation. And a judge has agreed that this evidence warrants halting your execution and reopening your case." Sarah felt her knees weaken. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It is real," Torres said. "Sarah, you're going to be moved back to regular death row housing while the investigation continues. But based on what we're seeing, I think there's a very good chance your conviction will be overturned." At 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes before her scheduled execution, the judge's official stay order arrived. Sarah Williams's execution was suspended indefinitely pending investigation of new evidence. Father Chen came to the meditation room and opened the door. Sarah was still sitting on the floor, crying, her hands pressed against her face. He knelt beside her. "Sarah, God heard your prayers." She looked up at him, her face a mixture of shock and joy and disbelief. "Something happened, Father. Something impossible. 6 hours. I prayed for 6 hours and everything changed." Father Chen helped her stand. "Let's get you back to your cell. You need to process all of this." As they walked through the chapel, Sarah saw the clock on the wall. Midnight. She should be dead, but she was walking, breathing, alive. Over the following days the investigation moved quickly. Robert Davidson, once he was conscious and coherent, confessed fully to Jennifer Cole's murder. He'd been Jennifer's accountant. He'd been embezzling money from the company, and Jennifer had discovered it. When she confronted him and threatened to report him, he'd panicked. The fight had escalated. He'd grabbed the letter opener from her desk, the same letter opener that Sarah had used innocently dozens of times, leaving her fingerprints on it. Jennifer had died, Davidson had fled, and when Sarah was arrested, he'd stayed silent, terrified that coming forward would mean his own arrest. The text messages recovered from Jennifer's phone corroborated his story. Even more damning, a search of Davidson's home turned up a journal where he'd written about his guilt over the years, about watching news coverage of Sarah's trial, about living with the knowledge that an innocent woman was paying for his crime. Within 2 weeks the prosecutor's office moved to vacate Sarah's conviction. Within 3 weeks, all charges were formally dropped. Sarah Williams was released from prison after 15 years of wrongful incarceration. Her release made national news. Woman freed after 6-hour prayer led to last-minute evidence. Some people call it a miracle. Skeptics pointed out that all the events, the fire, the confession, the recovery of the phone data, could be explained by natural causes and fortunate timing. There was no need to invoke the supernatural. Believers saw the hand of God in the perfect timing of events that separately might mean little, but together had saved an innocent life. Sarah didn't engage in the debate. When reporters asked her if she believed God had intervened, she simply said, "I prayed, and doors opened that had been closed for 15 years. You can call it whatever you want. I know what I believe." Sarah's mother broke down when she saw her daughter walk out of prison. They embraced for the first time without glass between them in 15 years. "I knew you were innocent," her mother sobbed. "I never stopped believing." "I know, Mom," Sarah said, "and I never stopped believing that truth matters, even when it takes time to surface." In the months that followed, Sarah struggled to adjust to freedom. 15 years in prison had changed her. The world had moved on. Technology was different. Society was different. She was different. But she also had something many wrongfully convicted people didn't have: a clear name. Proof of her innocence. A story of vindication that gave meaning to her suffering. She started speaking publicly about criminal justice reform, about the dangers of rushing to judgment, about the importance of thorough investigation. She became an advocate for other wrongfully convicted individuals, using her platform to shine light on cases that deserved a second look. And she maintained the faith that had sustained her through her darkest hours. She continued attending church, continued praying, continued believing that even in the midst of broken human systems, there was a justice that transcended courtrooms and verdicts. 1 year after her release, Sarah visited Father Chen at the prison. She'd wanted to thank him in person for his support during her 15 years of incarceration. They sat in the same chapel where she'd spent her final 6 hours. "Do you ever think about that night?" Father Chen asked. "All the time," Sarah replied. "People want to know if I think it was a miracle. If I think God intervened to save me. And what do you tell them?" "I tell them I don't know exactly how God works. I don't know if every prayer gets answered the way mine did. I don't know why I was saved when other innocent people have been executed. But I know that something happened that night that can't be fully explained by chance." 6 separate events, perfectly timed, each one necessary to halt my execution. A fire that uncovered evidence. A confession made under anesthesia. A heart attack that brought a guilty man to the hospital. A detective who refused to give up. A crime lab director who came in after hours. Text messages recovered from a damaged phone. Any one of those events alone wouldn't have been enough. But all of them together happening in the span of 6 hours while I was praying alone in a room? That's either the most incredible coincidence in history, or it's something more. Father Chen smiled. "And you believe it's something more?" "I believe that when I sat down in that room at 6 p.m., I was at peace with dying. I had made my peace with God, and with my fate. I wasn't begging or bargaining, or desperately trying to change the outcome. I was just sitting in God's presence, accepting whatever came next. And somehow, in that surrender, in that willingness to let go, space was created for the truth to emerge." 2 years after her release, Sarah received an unexpected letter. It was from the family of Jennifer Cole, the woman she'd been convicted of murdering. "We owe you an apology," the letter began. "For 15 years, we believed you had killed our daughter and sister. We testified against you at your trial. We spoke to the media about our relief when you were convicted. We celebrated when you were sentenced to death. We were wrong. We are so deeply sorry for the pain we caused you, for the role we played in your wrongful conviction, for the hatred we directed at you when you were innocent all along. If you're willing, we would like to meet with you. We'd like to hear about Jennifer from your perspective. We'd like to understand who she was to you. We'd like to try to heal some of the damage that's been done." Sarah read the letter 3 times, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at the years stolen from her, understanding that they'd been victims too, grieving a loved one, and believing justice had been served. And something else, forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness she'd learned in that meditation room. The kind that releases you from bitterness and allows healing to begin. She agreed to meet with Jennifer's family. The meeting was difficult, filled with tears and apologies, and shared grief, but it was also healing. They talked about Jennifer, about the business she and Sarah had built, about the dreams they'd had for the company's future. They talked about the real killer, Robert Davidson, and the betrayal he'd inflicted on everyone who'd known Jennifer. And they talked about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger only perpetuates the cycle of pain, about how justice and mercy sometimes have to exist side by side. By the time the meeting ended, they weren't friends exactly, but they weren't enemies either. They were people who'd been hurt by the same crime, who'd been manipulated by the same lies, who'd both lost years of their lives to someone else's violence and deception. 3 years after her release, Sarah published a book about her experience. She titled it 6 Hours, When Prayer Met Providence. The book became a bestseller, resonating with people from all walks of life and belief systems. Some readers were drawn to the spiritual aspects, seeing it as evidence of divine intervention. Others appreciated it as a story about the criminal justice system's fallibility and the importance of never giving up on truth. Sarah used the proceeds from the book to establish a foundation providing legal support for wrongfully convicted individuals. She hired private investigators. She funded DNA testing. She connected pro bono attorneys with cases that needed fresh eyes. She became the advocate she'd wished she'd had during her 15 years fighting for justice. And every March 15th, on the anniversary of the day she should have died, Sarah spent 6 hours in prayer, sometimes alone, sometimes with others who wanted to join her, but always in that same spirit of surrender and trust that she'd experienced in that meditation room. On the 5th anniversary of her non-execution, a reporter asked Sarah the question everyone wanted to know. If you could go back and prevent your wrongful conviction, prevent those 15 years in prison, would you? Sarah thought carefully before answering. Part of me wants to say yes, of course. 15 years of my life were stolen. I missed weddings and funerals and births. I missed my 20s and most of my 30s. I was labeled a murderer. Those years are gone forever. But another part of me knows that those 15 years made me who I am. They broke me down and rebuilt me. They taught me about faith and perseverance, and the power of truth. They gave me a platform I never would have had to advocate for others facing similar injustice. They connected me to people I never would have met. So would I change it? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I wouldn't trade what I learned in that meditation room. Those 6 hours taught me something that 15 years of suffering couldn't. They taught me that surrender isn't giving up. It's making space for something bigger than yourself to work. The foundation Sarah established freed 7 wrongfully convicted individuals in its first 5 years. Each case was different. Each person had their own story of injustice and survival. But Sarah saw her own journey reflected in each of them. The years of fighting, the exhaustion of hoping, and finally in different ways for different people, the breakthrough that brought truth to light. Sarah made sure to visit each person after their release, to help them navigate the overwhelming transition from prison to freedom. She understood what they were going through, in ways that even the most compassionate advocate couldn't. And she always told them about the 6 hours, not to promise them miracles or easy answers, but to share what she'd learned about faith, about surrender, about trusting that truth has power, even when it seems buried forever. 10 years after her release, Sarah married a man she'd met through her advocacy work. He was an attorney who specialized in wrongful conviction cases, and he'd been moved by her story. Their wedding was small and intimate, held in the same chapel where Sarah had prayed for 6 hours a decade earlier. Father Chen, now in his 70s and retired, performed the ceremony. As Sarah stood at the altar, she looked around at the faces gathered. Her mother, now elderly but beaming with joy. Jennifer Cole's sister, who'd become a close friend in the years since their first painful meeting. Former inmates whose lives Sarah had touched during her 15 years. Advocates and attorneys who worked alongside her foundation. And sitting in the front row, Warden Michael Torres, the man who'd had the authority to proceed with her execution but had chosen to delay. Who'd trusted his instincts that something wasn't right, and had given the universe time to prove him correct. In her wedding vows, Sarah included a line that made several people cry. I promise to face every challenge with you the way I faced those 6 hours. With faith, with surrender, with trust, that truth and love are more powerful than any darkness we encounter. After the ceremony, Torres approached Sarah. He was retired now, having left the prison system 2 years after her release. The experience of nearly executing an innocent woman had changed him, made him question everything about capital punishment and the systems he'd spent his career upholding. I think about that night all the time, Torres told Sarah, about how close we came, about how if any one of those events had happened differently or at a different time, you wouldn't be here. Sarah took his hand. But they didn't happen differently. They happened exactly when they needed to. And you made the choice to delay, to trust that something unusual was occurring. You could have proceeded with the execution regardless. Many wardens would have. Torres shook his head. After I saw those text messages, after I understood what was unfolding, I knew I was witnessing something extraordinary. Maybe it was divine intervention. Maybe it was an astronomical coincidence. But either way, I wasn't going to be the person who killed you when the universe was working so hard to save you. They stood together in silence for a moment. Two people forever connected by a night that had tested everything they believed about justice, faith, and the impossible. 15 years after her release, Sarah was invited to speak at the prison where she'd been incarcerated. The administration had undergone significant reforms, partly inspired by her case. They wanted her to speak to current death row inmates about hope and perseverance. Sarah walked through the familiar corridors, past cells that looked identical to the one she'd occupied for 15 years, past the chapel where she'd spent so many hours, and finally, to the small meditation room where she'd prayed for 6 hours and emerged to find her life transformed. The room looked the same: white walls, gray carpet, simple wooden chair, plain cross on the wall. Sarah stepped inside and sat in the same chair she'd occupied that night. The memories flooded back, the certainty that she would die, the peace she'd felt anyway, the prayers she'd prayed, the surrender she'd experienced, and then the knock on the door. The warden's voice. The impossible news. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thank you for those 6 hours. Thank you for teaching me that surrender isn't weakness. Thank you for showing me that truth is more powerful than lies, even when it takes time to emerge. Thank you for every person who played a role in saving my life, even those who didn't know they were doing it. And thank you for the 15 years that preceded those 6 hours, because without them, I wouldn't have known how to pray that prayer. When Sarah emerged from the meditation room, a group of death row inmates was waiting in the chapel. Some were guilty, some maintained their innocence. All of them were facing execution and grappling with that reality in their own ways. Sarah stood before them and told her story. Not to promise them miracles, not to suggest that if they prayed hard enough, they'd all be saved, but to offer something more subtle and more powerful. The possibility of peace, regardless of outcome. The power of truth to emerge in unexpected ways. The importance of never giving up, but also of knowing when to surrender the outcome to forces beyond their control. I can't promise you that what happened to me will happen to you, Sarah said. I don't understand why my prayers were answered that way when others who are just as innocent have been executed. I don't have easy answers about why God intervenes sometimes and not others. But I can tell you this: truth matters. Keep telling your truth, even when no one believes you. Justice may be slow and imperfect, but it's also persistent. And faith, real faith, isn't about manipulating outcomes. It's about finding peace in the presence of God regardless of circumstances. It's about surrendering control while still fighting for what's right. It's about trusting that your life has meaning even if the world says it doesn't. After the speech, several inmates approached Sarah individually. One man, serving time for a murder he insisted he didn't commit, asked her the hardest question. What if I don't get my miracle? What if I die here before the truth comes out? Sarah looked at him with compassion. Then you die knowing who you are. You die with integrity intact. You die holding on to truth even when the world has decided on a lie. That matters. That has value. Not just in some future reckoning, but right now. In how you treat the people around you. In how you spend your remaining days. In the legacy you leave for anyone paying attention. The man's eyes filled with tears. That's all I have left, my integrity. Then protect it, Sarah said. It's worth more than your freedom, more than your life, because they can take everything else from you. But they can't take who you choose to be in the face of injustice. On the 20th anniversary of her scheduled execution, Sarah returned once more to the meditation room. This time, she was accompanied by documentary filmmakers who were creating a film about her case and the events of that extraordinary night. The documentarians interviewed everyone involved, Warden Torres, talking about the decision to delay and the phone calls that had flooded his office that night. Detective Santos, describing the frantic investigation and the race against time. Dr. Wang from the crime lab, explaining the technical challenges of recovering data from a 15-year-old water-damaged phone. Father Chen, reflecting on Sarah's spiritual journey and the faith that had sustained her. And Jennifer Cole's sister, speaking about forgiveness and the complicated process of accepting that they'd been wrong about Sarah for 15 years. But the most powerful interview was with Sarah herself, sitting in the meditation room, talking about those 6 hours. I sat in this chair not knowing if I would live or die, Sarah told the camera. I had made my peace with dying. I wasn't frantically praying for a miracle. I wasn't bargaining with God. I was just being present, just existing in that moment with complete honesty about my situation and complete trust that whatever happened, I wasn't alone. The interviewer asked the question everyone wanted answered. Do you believe God intervened that night? Sarah smiled. I believe that when we create space for truth, truth finds a way to emerge. I believe that surrender can be more powerful than fighting. I believe that 6 hours of honest prayer opened something in me, and maybe opened something in the universe, that allowed long-buried secrets to come to light. Was it God? Was it coincidence? Was it some combination of human effort and divine grace? I don't need to know the answer to believe it was real. The documentary premiered to critical acclaim. It reignited conversations about capital punishment, wrongful convictions, the role of faith in the criminal justice system. Some viewers were moved to become advocates for reform. Others were inspired by the spiritual dimensions of the story, and some simply appreciated it as a reminder that truth, however long buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. 25 years after her release, Sarah stood before a crowded auditorium at a major university. She'd been invited to give a lecture on criminal justice reform and wrongful convictions. But as she looked out at the sea of young faces, she knew she needed to talk about something else, something more fundamental than legal procedures or investigative techniques. I'm going to tell you about 6 hours that changed my life, she began. But more importantly, I'm going to tell you what those 6 hours taught me about the power of surrender. We live in a culture that values control, that tells us if we work hard enough, fight hard enough, refuse to give up, we can overcome any obstacle. And there's truth in that. Persistence matters. Effort matters. Never giving up on what's right matters. But there's also a paradox. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop fighting and start surrendering. Not surrendering to injustice. Not giving up on truth. But surrendering our need to control the outcome. Surrendering our timeline for when things should happen. Surrendering our understanding of how justice should unfold. When I sat in that meditation room, I had done everything in my power to prove my innocence. I had fought for 15 years. I had exhausted every legal avenue. I had nothing left to do except sit in that chair and be honest with God about my situation. And in that honesty, in that surrender, something shifted. Sarah paused, looking around the auditorium. I can't promise you a miracle. I can't promise you that if you pray hard enough or believe hard enough, the universe will bend to your will. That's not how it works. But I can tell you that truth is more powerful than we give it credit for. That justice, however delayed, however imperfect, has a persistence that outlasts lies. That faith isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about trusting that your life has meaning regardless of outcomes. After the lecture, a young woman approached Sarah. She introduced herself as Emma, a journalism student working on a story about wrongful convictions. My professor assigned me to research your case, Emma said. And I have to tell you, I started out skeptical. I thought the whole miracle angle was religious people reading too much into a series of fortunate coincidences. But the more I researched, the more I interviewed people who were there, the less sure I became of my skepticism. Sarah smiled. What changed your mind? Emma pulled out her notebook, flipping through pages of notes. The timing. It's the timing that I can't explain away. The fire happened to break out on the exact night you needed evidence found. Robert Davidson happened to have a heart attack and confess while under anesthesia on the exact night you were scheduled to die. The crime lab director happened to be reachable and willing to come in after hours. The text messages happened to be recoverable even though they'd been water damaged for 15 years. Any one of those things could be coincidence, but all of them happening in the precise sequence needed to halt your execution, in the exact 6-hour window while you were praying. Emma shook her head. I'm still not sure I believe in divine intervention, but I'm no longer sure I don't believe in it either. And that uncertainty, that willingness to consider that there might be more to reality than what we can measure and explain, that's new for me. Sarah placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. That's exactly where you should be, in that space of not knowing for sure, but being open to possibility. That's where faith lives, not in certainty, but in trust, despite uncertainty. 5 years later, Emma's journalism career had flourished. She'd become an investigative reporter specializing in criminal justice issues, and she credited Sarah's story with inspiring that direction. She'd helped expose 3 cases of wrongful conviction, using the investigative skills she'd developed while researching Sarah's case, and she never forgot the lesson she'd learned, that truth has power, that persistence matters, and that sometimes the universe conspires to reveal what's been hidden when the timing is finally right. 30 years after her release, Sarah received an honorary doctorate from her alma mater. As she stood at the podium to give the commencement address, she looked out at the graduating students and felt the weight of all she'd experienced, all she'd learned, all she'd survived. You're graduating into a world that often feels unjust, Sarah told them. A world where innocent people suffer and guilty people escape consequences. A world where truth gets buried and lies spread faster. It's easy to become cynical. It's easy to give up on the idea that justice is possible. But I'm standing here today as evidence that truth matters. That justice, however slow, however imperfect, is worth fighting for. That 6 hours of honest prayer can unlock doors that 15 years of fighting couldn't open. Not because prayer is magic, but because prayer is surrender. And sometimes surrender is the most powerful thing we can do. She paused, letting her words sink in. I spent 15 years on death row for a murder I didn't commit. I came within minutes of being executed. That shouldn't have happened. The system failed me catastrophically. But here's what I want you to understand. Those 15 years weren't wasted. That mere execution wasn't meaningless. Because every experience, even the unjust ones, even the painful ones, shapes us, teaches us, gives us something we can use to help others. I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade what I learned about resilience, about faith, about the power of truth and the importance of never giving up on what's right. So as you go out into this imperfect world, remember that justice is a marathon, not a sprint. Remember that truth has power even when it's buried. Remember that surrender isn't weakness. And remember that 6 hours can change everything if you're willing to sit in them with complete honesty and trust. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Among them was Warden Torres, now in his 80s, but still sharp and engaged. He'd attended because Sarah had become like a daughter to him, a constant reminder of the night that had changed both their lives. After the ceremony, Torres approached Sarah. 30 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. 30 years since that night. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Do you ever wonder, what would have happened if I'd proceeded with the execution? Sarah took his hand. Every day. But I've learned not to dwell on alternate timelines. This is the timeline we're in. These are the lives we're living. And in this timeline, you made the choice to wait, to trust, to give truth time to emerge. That matters more than any what-ifs. Torres smiled. You know, I've thought a lot about faith since that night. I was never particularly religious. Still not sure I am. But I can't deny that something happened in those 6 hours. Something that can't be fully explained by chance or coincidence. Maybe that's what faith is. Not knowing for sure, but being unable to deny that there's something more than what we can see and measure. That's exactly what it is. Sarah agreed. 40 years after her wrongful conviction, Sarah was diagnosed with cancer. The prognosis was serious, but not hopeless. She faced treatment with the same equanimity she'd faced her death sentence 4 decades earlier. When friends and supporters expressed worry and sadness, Sarah reminded them gently of what she'd learned. We all die eventually. The question isn't whether, but how. Do we face our mortality with fear and denial, or with acceptance and grace? During her treatment, Sarah continued her advocacy work as much as her health allowed. She spoke at conferences via video call. She consulted on wrongful conviction cases from her hospital bed. She wrote articles about criminal justice reform between chemotherapy sessions. And she prayed. Not desperate prayers for healing, though she would have welcomed it, but prayers of gratitude for the life she'd lived, for the 40 years she'd been given after she should have died, for the people she'd helped, for the love she'd experienced, for the faith that had sustained her through everything. The cancer went into remission after 18 months of treatment. Sarah emerged thinner and weaker, but with the same unshakable peace that had characterized her since that night in the meditation room. On the 45th anniversary of her scheduled execution, Sarah returned one final time to the prison meditation room. She was 77 years old now, her hair white, her movements slower, but her spirit still vibrant. The prison had preserved the meditation room as a historical site, a reminder of the extraordinary events that had unfolded there. Tour groups sometimes visited, learning about the case and the 6 hours that had changed criminal justice history. But on this day, the room was reserved for Sarah. She sat in the same chair, in the same room, and reflected on 45 years of life she shouldn't have had. 45 years of freedom after 15 years of wrongful imprisonment. 45 years of advocacy and love and purpose. She thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with hers because of that night. Warden Torres, who'd become a criminal justice reformer. Detective Santos, who'd never given up on finding truth. Dr. Wong, who'd come in after hours to recover data from a damaged phone. Father Chen, who'd guided her spiritual journey until his death 5 years earlier. Jennifer Cole's family, who'd moved from hatred to friendship. The 7 people her foundation had freed from wrongful conviction. The hundreds of others who'd been inspired by her story to fight for justice. All of it had flowed from 6 hours in this room. 6 hours of surrender and prayer, and trust. Sarah closed her eyes, and prayed one final prayer in this space. Thank you. For those 6 hours. For the 45 years that followed. For every person who played a role in my story. For every lesson learned through suffering. For every moment of grace in the darkness. For showing me that truth is more powerful than lies. That justice, however delayed, is worth pursuing. That surrender is sometimes the strongest thing we can do. And that love, faith, and hope can survive anything. When Sarah opened her eyes, she felt complete. Her story had come full circle. The meditation room that had witnessed her last hours before a scheduled execution now witnessed her final visit. 45 years later, as an old woman who'd lived a full and meaningful life against all odds. Sarah stood slowly, her bones aching but her spirit light. She placed her hand on the wooden cross on the wall, the same cross she'd looked at for 6 hours, 4.5 decades ago. And then she walked out of the room, into the chapel, into the world, carrying with her the same peace she'd found in that chair all those years ago. Dear viewers, this is the story of Sarah Williams. A woman wrongfully convicted. A woman who came within minutes of execution. A woman who prayed for 6 hours, and witnessed events that can't be fully explained by coincidence alone. Her story reminds us that truth has power. That justice, however imperfect and delayed, matters. That faith isn't about controlling outcomes, but about trusting in meaning beyond what we can see. That surrender can be stronger than fighting. And that 6 hours can contain more transformation than 15 years of struggle. Whether you believe in divine intervention, or remarkable coincidence, Sarah's story challenges us to consider that reality might be more mysterious than we acknowledge. That prayer might have power we don't understand. That the universe might respond to authentic surrender in ways that defy explanation. But most importantly, Sarah's story teaches us that how we face our darkest moments defines us more than the moments themselves. She faced her impending execution with faith and peace. She faced 15 years of wrongful imprisonment, without losing her integrity. She faced freedom without bitterness. And she faced her entire life with the recognition that every experience, even the unjust ones, can become meaningful if we choose to transform suffering into purpose. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more true stories of justice, faith, and the impossible becoming possible. Share it with someone who needs to remember that truth is more powerful than lies, that hope can survive any darkness, and that sometimes when we stop fighting and start surrendering, the universe shifts in ways we never could have orchestrated ourselves. Remember Sarah Williams and the 6 hours that saved her life. Remember that it's never too late for truth to emerge, never too late for justice to be served, never too late to choose faith over fear, and never underestimate the power of 6 hours spent in honest prayer, authentic surrender, and complete trust that your life has meaning regardless of outcome. Sometimes coincidences line up so perfectly they look like miracles. Sometimes miracles work through what looks like coincidence. Sarah Williams prayed for 6 hours and walked out of a meditation room into freedom instead of death. And whether you call that divine intervention or the most extraordinary timing in history, everyone who witnessed it agrees on one thing. Something impossible happened that night. Something that changed not just Sarah's life, but the lives of everyone it touched. Something that reminds us that truth, however buried, finds a way to surface when the time is finally right.